We're reading A Beautiful Boy, A Father's Journey Through His Son's Addiction by David Sheff. And I'm really excited to share this book with you. I'm Dr. Alex Elswick. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist for substance use prevention and recovery at the University of Kentucky. And as you'll soon learn, I'm also a person in recovery. And this book was published shortly before my addiction began. And it became a really useful resource, not just for me, but also for all the members of my family, my parents and my siblings, to learn more about addiction, to learn from other people's experiences. And I'm hopeful that we can do a little bit of that tonight as we go into breakout sessions and we can learn a little bit from each other. To begin with, I wanted to just go through some housekeeping. Remember that we're reading the book in 3 parts. So hopefully you've read parts 1 and 2 for today. If you haven't, don't panic. You won't be graded. You're not going to receive any zeros. You can read up through part 4 for next week. It just means you've got some good reading ahead of you. And then in the final week, we'll read part 5 and the epilogue. And the epilogue is really interesting. It sort of was written, after the publication of the book, and really adds a wrinkle to Nick's story. So we'll talk some more about that when we get there. One more bit of housekeeping, and that is that this book that we're reading is a memoir of addiction. It's David's account of his son's addiction, but it is a memoir of addiction, and that necessarily means that there's a lot of graphic material. And I felt like it was necessary to give you that forewarning as soon as possible. And that's both in terms of content and language, as I'm sure you've figured out already if you've read the introduction in part 1 and 2. Nick Sheff displays a particular penchant for using the F word, so I apologize for that. But what I appreciate about it is that David is trying to relate to us as candid a story as he can, as honest a portrayal of his family's experience with addiction as he can. And that, I think, is something we need more of, so that we don't whitewash it and dress it up to be something different than it really is. And then in addition to that, the content itself can be rather graphic. And so I also wanted to let this serve as a trigger warning for people who might be in recovery, joining the book club, or people who have family members who've experienced addiction. This is really difficult to think about and to empathize with, and to think about your own family members in some of these situations. And so just wanted to offer that warning to you ahead of time. And also sort of a disclaimer. I wrote this to parents, but it occurs to me that it really applies to you regardless of how you come to the book club tonight. There's no right or wrong when it comes to addiction. Addiction's so complex, and recovery is also so complex that I want to make sure we don't feel judgment here. We're not here to tell anybody that the way that they're operating is wrong or incorrect. But fortunate for us, David writes his story in such a way that it feels to me like he's sort of inviting us to think about how he's handling these situations, and maybe even inviting us to critique it a little bit. And so we're fortunate for that opportunity. So David's going to tell his story as we read. I'll share a little bit of research to add a little bit of science to our discussion, and then we can all share our experiences, our thoughts, and ideas that come with addiction. Really quickly, I don't want to take too much time here, but for those of you who don't know me, I thought I would introduce myself. I've been fortunate to learn about addiction from a lot of different experiences. So the most important thing about me, I think, is I'm a person in recovery from SUD, which is substance use disorder. That's our clinical term for an addiction. I got addicted to prescription opioids at 18 years old, and went all the bad places that a person can go in addiction. I went to jail on drug trafficking charges. I went in and out of treatment, on and off the street, and I ended up homeless and addicted to heroin. And the last day I found it necessary to use was September 13th of 2013. So there's so much about this book that I identify with. I'm also an addiction researcher, and what I really research is long-term recovery. So sometimes people say, oh, you research addiction, that must be a bummer. And I tell them, really, I research the hopeful side of things. I'm also a recovery coach, which means sometimes I work one-on-one with individuals in addiction, and that teaches me a lot about the real barriers that people face to getting well in their experience. I also co-founded a nonprofit recovery community organization in Lexington, and we're a peer-run organization. So all of our staff are people in recovery who help people in recovery. And I've learned a lot about addiction through those experiences as well. And then finally, I have clinical experience. So I actually started my career as a family therapist because my family had been so impacted by my addiction. And I saw the ways that it affected everyone around me. And I really wanted to go and help other families who've been impacted similarly to mine. So I have a little bit of experience that I hope to be able to share with you all as we go through the book club as well. So now let's meet the Sheff family. I'm not going to, book review for you or take you all the way back through what you've already read. I don't want to waste our time that way, but just to kind of put faces with names. This is Nick and David Sheff, sort of our protagonists in the book. David is writing about his son, Nick's experience. Karen is Nick's stepmother, David's second wife, who lives in home. And Vicky is Nick's mother, who lives across the country, who David writes quite a bit about Nick having to travel back and forth between homes and between environments. And he talks at length about the stress of being the child of divorce, which we'll discuss. And then Daisy and Jasper are Nick's siblings at the start of the book. And that really is where David chooses to begin the book. He dives into the introduction by telling a story about Nick returning home from college. And he focuses so much of the opening introduction on the relationship between Nick and his siblings, Jasper and Daisy. And I love that so much as a rhetorical choice that the author made, because so many books of addiction begin with really graphic, dark elements of addiction. So they start at rock bottom. They start with these really stigmatized stories of addiction. And I appreciate that what the author is trying to do here is say, this is my family. These are the people that I love. My son is not a bad person. You see, just even in the opening stanza, the way that Nick interacts with his siblings, the way that they adore their brother, that can't be a bad person. And that's, I think, part of what David's trying to get us to identify with is this is a normal family. It's normal, whatever that means. When I was in my clinical training, we used to say that a normal is a setting on a dryer, right? Like there is no such thing as a normal family. But insofar as we can tell, David's family is pretty normal, and they have healthy relationships. And I think that's really a humanizing way to begin this book, by focusing on the people in the book and not the drugs themselves. So we're going to launch into our first breakout session. Mindy is going to break you all up into breakout rooms. You're going to have about 10 minutes. And what I want you to discuss is think about what brings you to the book club tonight and what experiences you're bringing with you as it relates to addiction. And really quickly, this is an exercise we actually do in research. We call it bracketing your own experience. So when you do research, you want to make sure that your own experience isn't kind of biasing the research process. And so sometimes you'll write about what's been your own experience with whatever you're studying. So sometimes I'll write about my own experience with addiction so that I set it aside and I'm not letting it bias the discussion. So this is kind of our opportunity to just discuss what's been our experience, what's been our biases with addiction. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Word of welcome to folks who may have joined a little after we started. I told everyone that if you hadn't read parts 1 and 2 for today, that you won't be getting any zeros for your assignment. And if you showed up a little tardy today, you won't be getting any points off for that either. We're going to keep it very casual. We were just in a breakout room. I wonder if I could get anybody who would be willing to share in front of the big group a little bit about what they shared in their breakout group. Just what experience you're bringing with you as it relates to addiction and kind of why you're here tonight. And it's going to require someone to be bold and step up.
Well, I'm a retired teacher from Breathitt County, and I think a lot of our breakout room was from, we agree that addiction comes in many forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being bold and speaking up. And that's very accurate and very much part of David and Nick's story. You can tell David is pretty affluent. He's a writer. He does well. He comes from a higher socioeconomic status, and addiction affects his family all the same. So we say that addiction is a family disease, and we mean that in a couple of different ways. And I love a line that I picked out early in the book from page 11. It's possible to love a child who's lost, possibly even forever. And it reminds me of some of my mom's own experience with my addiction. She would talk about how she had to grieve the loss of a child who's still alive. That's how she described being in a relationship with a child who's addicted. And that's, I think, a pretty accurate description. And then David goes on to say, I became addicted to my child's addiction. And I think, for my part, I've read this book now, to be honest with you all, 4 different times. I think this is the most significant line in the entire book, because I think it's so true to the experience of family members. He became addicted to his child's addiction, meaning that he becomes so hyper-focused, so sort of obsessed with his concern for his child. And that can become something that can become a real negative weight that's borne by the family. It can be a real stressor for the family. It can cause deteriorating physical health and mental health and spiritual health. And what happens is all of the resources in the family, all of the family members' time and energy and money gets marshaled towards trying to address the addiction. And then other relationships in the family suffer as a consequence. So, parents' marriage might suffer, or relationships among siblings might suffer. And so in this way, addiction doesn't happen in isolation. And it's part of what the training that I got in a family therapy program, because an individual therapist would treat addiction as an individual problem. But a family therapist says, hey, this person lives in a family system. And so we can treat this entire family system and make sure that the family members who are being affected by the addiction are taken care of as well. He also says, I found this interesting. He says, we're the first generation of self-conscious parents. And I don't know exactly how he means that. It'd be interesting to ask him. But the way that I interpreted it was like previous generations haven't had the luxury of being self-conscious about their parenting. Sort of if you were a Depression era parent or before, you didn't have the time to be worried about how good your parenting was because you were so focused on survival, right? But today, we have it a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier to sort of focus on parenting and focus on meeting the needs of young children. And so David, throughout the part 1 and really throughout the book, he's plagued by this concern that he's caused Nick's addiction, either directly or indirectly, that he's responsible for Nick's addiction. And if you're a family member of someone who's addicted, you might be able to identify with this a little bit. And so I thought it might be useful in adding a little bit of science to our discussion to talk about what are the risk factors that families actually influence. So there are risk and protective factors refer to anything that increases or decreases the likelihood that a person gets addicted. So protective factors protect you from becoming addicted, and risk factors increase your risk of becoming addicted. And there are lots and lots of risk and protective factors. The most important ones actually relate to things like genetics and mental health. But if we're just looking specifically at families and what impact, like for instance, parents might have, here are some of those factors. So having parents who use drugs and alcohol, that's probably an obvious one. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. If your parents use illicit drugs or abuse alcohol, then you're having that behavior modeled for you right in front of your eyes. Also, having parents who suffer from mental illness, particularly untreated mental illness, is a risk factor for that child to become addicted. And then experiencing any of what we call the ACEs, so the adverse childhood experiences. These are things like neglect and abuse, or having a parent who's incarcerated, which we have an exceedingly high rate of in the state of Kentucky. We actually lead the country in the number of children in kinship care because their parents are incarcerated due to a drug addiction. And then also inadequate supervision. And that basically means if your parents weren't around, if your parents didn't keep a very good eye on you, it was easier for you to get into trouble. And that increases your odds of becoming addicted. But it isn't all bad. There are also protective factors. There are also ways that family members can reduce the risk of their loved ones becoming addicted. And a big one is parental involvement. It goes so far, actually, as there's some research indicating that family dinners are an intervention that makes it less likely that your kids will become addicted. And that probably has less to do with the calories that you're eating as a part of your dinner and more to do with the social connection, being connected to your child. Also, research shows that when kids have a significant relationship with an adult who's not their parents, that can be a really important outlet So it's a part of normal child development for adolescents to go through puberty and want to push back and be independent from their parents. So I'm sure many of you have experienced this. Your kids think you don't know anything all of a sudden, and mom and dad don't know what they're talking about. So it's important at that time in a child's life that they have a significant non-parental adult role model who can provide sort of some guidance and some mentorship. And then also basic knowledge of parenting and child development, being aware of what is sort of age and stage appropriate for your child, so that you're attuned to whether or not your kid is experiencing like delays in development or something that we should be paying attention to. And in looking at risk and protective factors that David talks about in the book, one that he focuses on in chapter 3, I kind of characterized as the world is too much with us. And he sort of talks about how this generation, Nick's generation, really my generation, is the first to grow up with the internet and social media in such a way that all of the violence and all of the suffering that exists in the world is right in front of our faces on our laptops and on our iPhones 24 hours a day. And all day long, we're scrolling through social media news feeds, and we're seeing political discord and violence and suffering, and that it creates what some people have argued is kind of like a form of post-traumatic stress disorder in young people, in young adults in my generation. And so he discusses that concern. But as I mentioned earlier, David's chief concern is that his divorce from his wife has caused Nick's addiction. And so in chapter 5, he talks at length about some research from a researcher named Dr. Judith Wallerstein, who's looked at the negative impact of divorce. And so he acknowledges that the research shows divorce does typically have a negative impact on children. But also, we want to be careful not to ever blame a parent for an addiction, because that's not the way that addiction works. Also in chapter 5, Nick meets Dawn, who's the cool teacher, the teacher he surfs with and connects with. And I just thought it was worth mentioning here that that's one of those protective factors, that significant relationship is part of why Nick really seems to thrive during this time in his life. So did David or David's divorce cause Nick's addiction? Of course it did not. And I felt like it was worth dedicating a slide to saying that out loud, because I don't want anyone to walk away uncertain about that. People don't cause addiction. So in Al-Anon, which is a 12-step companion program to AA, so your addicted loved one might go to AA, and you, the family member, might go to Al-Anon for support. In Al-Anon, family members are taught the 3 C's. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. And for a lot of family members, as they come to internalize that, as they come to learn from the experiences of other family members, it really becomes a helpful mantra to realize I didn't cause this thing, and I'm not going to be able to control it, and I'm not going to be able to solve it, right? It's kind of freeing in some ways. And so David starts looking for signs of problems in his son, and he describes this struggle with trying to differentiate normal child development from signs of drug use. And that's particularly difficult because the time when kids are most likely to start using drugs is during adolescence. It happens to be the very same time that kids all of a sudden become moody and strange characters, right? So oftentimes we say the signs of drug use are things like changes in appetite, changes in weight, changes in mood. But how would you describe adolescence and puberty if not changes in appetite, changes in weight, changes in mood, right? So it can be really difficult to discern, is it normal for my kid to be this moody, or could this be because they're using drugs? Also, research shows that transitions are a really important risk factor for addiction. So that could be transitions in development, like puberty, or it could be transitions in school. So for instance, someone transitioning from middle school to high school or high school to college causes a tear in their social fabric, which is destabilizing, and it introduces some risk for drug use and addiction. Later on page 50, David describes marijuana as a passkey to a loosely defined social circle. And I thought that was a really well-written sentence, because in many ways, that was my experience when I was young. And I think it's the experience of a lot of my friends that marijuana becomes sort of a shortcut into acceptance, into different social circles, and social circles that cut across different peer groups. So when I was in high school, it didn't matter if you were a a jock or a prep or a goth or whatever all the labels are, there were kids in all those groups who used marijuana, and it was a way for people to sort of have a way into a group. And that, of course, is a risk factor for addiction. The age at which a person first uses a drug, the earlier that you use a drug the first time in your life, the more likely you are to experience addiction. And so David discovers that Nick is using cannabis. And so I think this brings us to our second breakout. We're going to send you into breakout rooms, and I want you to think as professionals, as family members, as parents. How do you think that Nick's family addressed his drug use when they first discovered that he was using marijuana? Would you have done something differently? Do you think they addressed it properly? Do you think they were too cavalier about it, didn't take it seriously enough? Or do you think they were too heavy-handed? What do you think? What are your thoughts? And I'll see you in 10 minutes. Good luck. Breakout, definitely a realistic scenario. I was just thinking when I sent you all into breakout that I was just looking at some survey data, and about 20% of Americans used marijuana last year, and about half that, about 10% of young people, adolescents, used marijuana last year. So it's not uncommon, maybe something that some of you all have run into yourselves as parents. I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to share kind of what you talked about in your breakout. Need somebody to be really bold this time. So just feel free to unmute yourselves and share.
Alex, I'd love to share what we were talking about in our group. We have a couple of readers, and just a quick brief background. One has an experience with addiction, and one has a child who is dealing with autism. And she was talking about, this parent was talking about how she was able to relate so much about what's happening in the book with Nick, in the way that they're responding, in the way that David is so transparent, in the way that he's unsure of what he's doing, whether it's right or wrong. And what was interesting about that is I began to pinpoint a little bit about the relationship with taking the disease model, and I'm well aware, and not trying to offend or to connect the two. I know autism is not a disease, but again, genetic, and there's some very genetic components to addiction. But how oftentimes what we want to do is kind of run to this parental cause, or this idea of the response wasn't correct, and therefore it created this poop storm later in life. But the reality is, if we can really find it and ground it in that genetic component, then the reality becomes that there's very little what we say or do that might change the outcome in that. But if we fall and fallace ourselves to the idea that our responses are what's triggering those, then we kind of fall into that cascade that David just was in this idea that, oh my gosh, I caused it, I control it, I can cure it, right? This idea. So I mean, I think in some ways I appreciated the question, and I more so appreciated the rich discussion, but it kind of landed me in this space as I talk with the group that, let us not be swayed by this idea or get to the point of maybe quick finger pointing, is to say this was a poor response and this response would have been better. Because if disease is at the heart of this, then maybe the response had very little to do with the outcome at all.
Yeah, you rock, David. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you to your all's group for contributing that discussion. You're exactly right. I have a friend who works in the field. His name's Jeremy, and he likes to say, you can't blame somebody for doing it wrong if nobody knows how to do it right. And I think that's a good way to put it, because there's no manual for dealing with or helping your loved ones who are addicted. In fact, there's a real gap in the research. There's a real problem with making sure that people even know what their loved ones need. Did anybody else want to share before we move on?
Alex, this is Sheila. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It seems like Nick, I know he got grounded or whatever they did to him, and he said he'd only done it once or twice and he didn't even like it anyway. He wasn't going to do it anymore. I think as a parent at that point, I mean, it was early on, but looking at everything that's happened in this book, I don't know that you should trust teenagers. I hate to say that, but that wasn't a trustworthy teenager, because he'd already done what they'd asked him not to do. So I think I would have wanted to have a urine sample every week to be sure that he truly wasn't doing it anymore. I mean,
Wow.
I know that's too controlling, but I mean,
No, I appreciate that. And it really it gives me an opportunity to share just a little bit about my own experience. My drug use began with alcohol and nicotine, but then I started using marijuana, and my parents found out that I was using marijuana, and their response was very serious. They grounded me for a period of time, took my car for a period of time, restricted who I could see for a period of time. I think largely most of the parenting manuals would say their response was pretty strict and pretty appropriate. And I think a little bit it goes to David's point that the real risk factors that drive addiction, it's not to say that families can't influence it a little bit, because they can, and research shows they can, but the major risk factors that drive addiction are largely outside of the control of parents. So it really is wrong for us to be assigning blame there. So David goes on and continues looking for signs that either his son is okay or that his son is continuing to develop a problem. And at one point, I forget a little bit chronologically where this was in the beginning of the book, but Nick developed an ulcer. And I thought it was worth mentioning just that that's not normal, that most people don't develop ulcers. And that's a sign, it's indicative of stress, and that he's having trouble coping with the stress in his life. And I identify with that because one of the early signs that I was experiencing stress that led to my drug use was an anxiety disorder called trichotillomania, where I was pulling hairs out of my eyebrows. And until my eyebrows were completely gone, and I wasn't doing it intentionally. And I often think that's not normal, right? That's pretty clear evidence that I'm dealing with some stress that I'm not coping with very well. And so that presented a risk factor. Another big risk factor that I could identify with was Nick became disinterested in the things that used to bring him pleasure. So Nick had a certain identity as a human being, and that identity sort of started to fade away as he got into using drugs more and more. And that was my experience. I went to college to play baseball. It had been my only dream when I was a kid. And very quickly, as my addiction took hold, baseball didn't matter to me anymore. And I gave up the opportunity to play baseball. And I think of that oftentimes as a really clear indication that something's not right. That people are no longer getting pleasure from things that really should be bringing them pleasure. Nick goes to see a therapist. And so I thought, while we're being critical of David and the parents at times, we should also give credit where credit's due. And David acknowledges that Nick's having trouble, so he gets him some help with counseling. That's a protective factor. But then Nick drops out of school. And it's interesting and worth noting that falling behind academically is actually a really robust risk factor for addiction. It's a much bigger risk factor than I realized before I started diving into the research. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Falling behind a grade doesn't just come with guilt and shame, but it also changes your social friend group. And there can be a lot of reasons why that might introduce risk. And I thought this was a great quote that David included from a Dr. Schwiebel on page 98. And I'm going to read it here in full. He says, drugs shield kids from dealing with reality and mastering developmental tasks. The skills they lacked that left them vulnerable to drugs in the first place are the very ones that are then stunted by drugs. They'll have difficulty establishing a clear sense of identity, mastering intellectual skills, and learning self-control. The adolescent period is when individuals are supposed to make the transition from childhood to adulthood, but teenagers with drug problems will not be prepared for adult roles. They'll be chronologically mature while remaining emotional adolescents. And that's a little bit infantilizing and a little bit harsh, but also a little bit true. It's true of my own experience and the experience of so many of my friends. For my master's thesis, I interviewed people who were early in recovery, and I asked them about challenges that they faced. And one thing that came up, to my surprise, more than once was adulting. And they said, I've never learned how to pay bills. I've never learned how to live on my own. While the rest of my friends went to college and learned how to be independent, I was addicted, and I wasn't able to learn how to do that. And also, that line, the skills they lacked that left them vulnerable to drugs in the first place are the very ones that are then stunted by drugs. So for instance, in my case, the thing that left me vulnerable to drugs in the first place was my anxiety and my inability to cope with my anxiety. But then as I continued to use drugs as a way to cope, I was even farther behind in developing my own ability, honing my own ability to cope with my own stress and anxiety, right? So in that way, we can fall 10 years behind. One way that this is described to me, thinking about early drug use, is like hardware versus software. So if you download a virus onto software on your computer, it's bad, but it's not as problematic because you can take it out and you can insert new software. But if the virus is hardwired into your computer, you have a real problem. And in some ways, that's what happens when people use drugs before their brains have achieved full development. It's sort of like we're hardwiring that habit. And also, one other thing to mention about the brain, we're not going to do a whole brain science spiel today, but adolescents have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, which is essentially the stop system in our brains. The system in our brains that says, that might come with some consequences. We probably shouldn't do that. Well, adolescents don't really have a developed prefrontal cortex. What they do have is a really good gas. They're all gas and no brakes. And that's why they're so good at making really impulsive, really stupid, short-sighted decisions. It's also why they're at incredibly high risk for developing a problem with drugs, because they're going to be more likely to take risks. So David smokes pot with Nick. And this is the way that I read it. I don't know how you all read this. For me, this was kind of heavy because I thought, David could have written this entire book and chosen to just leave that little part out. And because obviously he's quite ashamed of it, but instead he chose to tell the truth and to give us a really candid portrayal. And I have no doubt that David regrets this. I have no doubt that it was not a positive thing for Nick, for his dad to sort of make it seem like, continuing to use cannabis was okay and to sort of endorse that. But at the same time, going back to our previous discussion, Nick doesn't become addicted because his dad smoked pot with him one time. It's not how addiction works. It's immensely more complex than that. And then also, as David is dealing with all the pressure and all the anxiety of trying to figure out how to do what's right, he's getting contradictory advice. And I hear this from family members of addicted loved ones every single day, literally every single day. People are telling him to kick him out or he's safer at home. You should address the problem or you're making too big a deal out of it. Ignore it. He's just a kid smoking pot. You need to take him to treatment because he has a drug problem, or you need to quit making a big deal out of it. When Nick got arrested, you should bail him out, or people are saying you should leave him in jail because you're enabling his addiction if you bail him out. And none of those are necessarily right or wrong. The science hasn't done a good job of telling us how family members should support their loved ones. And so in the absence of right, we're not going to tell people they're doing it wrong. Right? However, if we can wade into the nuance, we've made it clear that family members don't cause this, they don't control it, they don't cure it, but it's also true. Can we hold that in our minds at the same time that we can hold it in our minds that family members can contribute? They can contribute negatively and they can contribute positively. They're not going to cause it, but they can contribute. And most often, the way that family members contribute negatively is through judgment and shame. And in my experience, it's not intentional. They're not trying to make their family members feel bad. It really stems from not understanding addiction and from a belief that if they loved me enough, they would stop hurting me by using this drug. And unfortunately, that's not the way that it works. Also, there's research that shows that when there's negative emotion in your household, you're more likely to relapse. And so I think that's important for family members of addicted loved ones to think about. That's not to say that we want family members walking on eggshells. We don't want to feel like it's a fragile emotional environment. But it does mean that lumping on the judgment and shame is not going to be the thing that's going to help people sustain changes. So Nick goes off the map. He disappears for 4 days, which is really a characteristic of the drug in particular that he's using. So Nick is using methamphetamine, which is a stimulant. And stimulants are more conducive to binging. So people are more likely to use methamphetamine and crack cocaine on binges where they might disappear for days at a time and continue using and using, whereas people using other drugs like opioids are less likely to binge in that sense. But I also thought it was worth mentioning, this book is about meth, but if you have a family member who's addicted to anything else, it relates all the same. So I appreciate that David was able to share a family member, a parent of a child with autism, and the way that you can see the stress and the confusion over what's right is similar, whether we're talking about an autism spectrum disorder or addiction. In the same way, it doesn't matter if we're talking about addiction to meth, to alcohol, to heroin, to fentanyl, or even if we're talking about addiction to sex or pornography or food or gambling. really they look the same. And so I just didn't want anyone to be dissuaded by that, by thinking, oh, well, my family member wasn't addicted to meth, so that isn't my experience. And so David becomes obsessed with learning about meth. And my parents could also identify with this experience. I started using heroin, and of course, my dad's a doctor, my mom's an accountant. They're just a little sweet suburban family. They don't know anything about heroin. And so it scared them to death. And the first thing they did was try to learn as much as they could, which is a good thing. But if I could make one suggestion, not that I want to be critical of David, but if I were to suggest what might have helped him even more, is had he tried to learn about addiction. Because learning about individual drugs is not all that helpful. You can learn about individual risk. You can learn about the pharmacology of the drugs, the way they act in the brain. But at the end of the day, what we care about is people, not the drugs. And so what we need to learn about is the process of addiction that's happening in the brains and the bodies of our loved ones, to be able to learn more about how to support them in a meaningful way. So we're going to launch now into our, before we do, I was going to mention civil commitment laws and David seeking help. So David goes through a big portion of this book frantically trying to find help for his son. And if you're a family member of an addicted loved one, you know exactly what this is like. There were times when it was clear that I needed to go to rehab or I needed some sort of treatment, but I would refuse to go because I just couldn't get over that hump. I just didn't think I could do it. And so my mom would have to wait until a time would come that I would be willing and able to go to treatment. And then when that 10-minute window comes, she's in an absolute frenzy trying to find a treatment center that we can afford, that takes our insurance, that has a bed that's available. And it's a nightmare of stress and anxiety for family members. That's why one of the first projects we took on at Voices of Hope was to create a treatment locator, a real-time treatment locator, to help family members very quickly say, if I need help and I need help on demand, I need to get it now. David also has trouble determining what's quality treatment. What path should he take? Should he be getting his kid on medications? Should he be taking his kid to outpatient, to inpatient? What's the right answer? And there is no right answer. It's really difficult to know. Lastly, David does not have a civil commitment law at his disposal. So civil commitment, it's problematic that Nick ages out. He becomes 18 years old, he becomes an adult. And then David no longer has the legal control over Nick's life. And this is really a turning point for a lot of parents who have children who become addicted. Because at the time, David didn't have access to a civil commitment law. And civil commitment laws are basically a way to help save people from themselves. So if you think that your child, let's say they're using heroin and you're afraid that they're going to overdose and die, you can get them diagnosed by a doctor and then take that diagnosis to a judge and implore the judge to coerce them either into treatment at threat of going to jail. So if they refuse treatment, they have to go to jail. And then either way, in some sense, people know that their family members are safe. We have a law like that in the state of Kentucky. Charlotte Wethington is a woman, a colleague of mine, a woman who lives in Northern Kentucky, and she lost her son, Casey, to an overdose, a heroin overdose, in maybe 2013. It was early on in the epidemic. And so she passed Casey's law, which is a civil commitment law that gives parents the ability to intervene on their loved one's behalf. So I just thought family members should be aware that that resource is available in Kentucky. So now we're going to launch into our third and final breakout of the day. And this is a similar question to the last one, but slightly different. How well do you think Nick's family addressed his drug use when it became chaotic, when it became methamphetamine, right? When Nick had disappeared off the map for 4 days. So at the second breakout, you were talking about how you addressed it at the first sign of drug use when he was smoking pot as a kid. Now we're talking about the signs that Nick is becoming addicted and has a serious problem. So enjoy your breakout. Hope you have a good discussion, and we'll wrap up very quickly when you come back. I realize we've run just a little bit over time. I apologize for that. I'd hope to keep us right at an hour. So we're going to cut loose here shortly. But I did want to hear some of your thoughts from your breakout room. What did you think of Nick's family's response to his drug use when it became clear that he was really having a problem? And feel free to just go ahead.
I think in our group, it was pretty much a consensus that you're going. because you have finally reached bottom to where you are asking for help, and where you're going to get that help. Even if you change your mind, you're going to get that help.
Yeah, and I think David is definitely feeling that sense of urgency as time goes on, as he's starting to call hospitals and police departments, trying to figure out what's happened to his son. But he's facing that challenge, which is his son's over 18. And so if his son says no, he has some options like kick him out of the house, not support him financially, but he can't quite control what his son does. Any other groups have some other thoughts?
He can't control his son before the kid is 18 either. In reality.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think it's something that parents reckon with, the extent to which, we can really kind of control the things that our kids do. And certainly in the case of drug use, even if you set the conditions right, it doesn't mean that kids are always going to make the choices you wish that they would make.
In my group, one lady said, and I agree with her, I have heard this from other people that were addicted and then are clean or have been clean for a while on the road. And they had to wait until they decided they were ready. And that was the key, that no one could say anything or do anything. But
Yes, I have a mentor, a mentor in therapy who used to say, in 30 years of doing therapy, I've never solved a problem for someone who didn't think they had a problem, right? And so, and I think there's some truth to that. The problem that it creates, the tension for families is, so what do you do for your loved one while they're in that time when they're not ready, they're not committed to recovery? Because for most people, there is a period of time between addiction and recovery where they're not quite yet committed. They're not, it's suffering. It's a lot of suffering early in recovery, and they're not ready to commit to going through that. And so it presents a real question for family members. And that's a perfect place to leave it tonight, because that's really the tension that we're going to dive into in parts 3 and 4, as unfortunately Nick's addiction continues. So we're going to close it here for the night. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to do the book clubs because I only pick books that I really like, that I really am excited to discuss. So enjoy reading parts 3 and 4, and we'll come back together next Tuesday at 6:30 and we'll discuss.